In the Hunts Point section of the Bronx, families lived in rows of brick buildings on Hunts Point Avenue that looked ordinary from the outside. Inside, however, the apartments weren't ordinary homes. They were part of New York City's cluster site program. These were private apartments rented by the city to house homeless families, a program long criticized for poor conditions, neglectful landlords, and safety hazards that tenants often said went unaddressed. The Ambrose family had been placed there. Danielle and Peter were raising their two daughters. One was barely 1 year old and the other just 2. Their apartment was on the first floor, and like many older Bronx apartments, it was heated by a steam radiator, a technology that, while common, carries risks if not properly maintained. Now, radiators are connected to high-pressure steam pipes that run throughout the building, and that can reach temperatures above 200 degrees. Any failure of valves or caps can turn them from sources of warmth into dangerous machines. On the afternoon of December 7th, 2016, the Ambrose sisters were in their bedroom, a small first-floor space, barely enough for 2 children's beds and a radiator pressed against the wall. Their parents believed they were safe, napping in the familiar warmth that the old cast iron radiator provided. So a few hours go by and the parents were doing their normal activities around the house, until they heard a loud and violent pop. Then they would feel like if the room they were in was getting hotter by the second, but almost immediately after they would hear something horrifying. They heard screams, and not just any screams, it was their kids. So like any parent, when they hear their kids scream, they would run to their kid's bedroom. But they would notice something odd. The closer they got to the bedroom, the hotter it would get. So as they finally got to the bedroom door, they could see steam coming from underneath the door creeping out. By now, the kids had stopped screaming. It was replaced by the sound of something screeching. When they opened the door, they were blasted by the heated steam. But when they got in, it was like stepping into another world. The room they once knew, the place with their daughter's small beds, scattered toys, and colorful blankets, was unrecognizable. It had transformed into a suffocating white chamber, thick steam pressed against their skin and lungs, making it nearly impossible to breathe. The windows were fog solid, water beating and running down the panes, dripping into the floorboards with a steady patter. The old radiator roared like a broken engine, its valve gone, releasing a continuous jet of vapor that filled the air with a piercing hiss. Every surface was slick with condensation, the walls sweating, the blankets soaked through it in seconds. The air itself felt alive, clawing, searing, and heavy, and in the middle of all of it were the 2 girls. Their tiny frames were barely visible through the dense fog, outlines blurred by the swirling mist. The parents tried to push forward, but the heat struck them like a wall, forcing them to shield their faces with their arms. Their instincts told them to grab their children, but every step towards those beds meant entering a cloud hot enough to burn through clothing. They just couldn't get to them. But by now, one of the neighbors had heard the loud pop and the kids screaming and had called emergency services. One of the other neighbors had pulled the fire alarm, as even though the valve that popped was in the Ambrose's apartment, they could still feel the heat creeping into the hallway. Steam was rolling out from under the Ambrose's door, curling upward into the corridor lights, and the normally still air of the building now felt damp and stifling. Neighbors gathered in confusion and fear, some shouting down the stairwell for help, others pounding on doors to make sure everyone was awake and aware. Inside, Danielle and Peter were still fighting against the impossible heat. Each time they tried to push deeper into the room, the scorching vapor forced them back, burning their skin and filling their lungs with air so hot it was like breathing fire. They shouted their daughters' names over and over, their voices hoarse, praying the girls would answer. But the only sound left was the relentless hiss of the radiator screeching like a broken whistle as it continued to pump steam into the bedroom. Within minutes, the hallway was filled with shouts and blare of alarms. The fire department arrived quickly, sirens echoing off the brick buildings of the Hunts Point Avenue. Firefighters rushed inside, masks on, turnout gear, shielding them from the heat that ordinary clothes could not withstand. They forced their way through the cloud, visibility near zero, feeling their way forward until they reached the children's beds. When they emerged, the scene was silent, but for the hiss of the broken radiator and the wails of the parents in the hallway. The firefighters carried the 2 girls out in the cold December air and straight into waiting ambulances. Danielle and Peter followed, staggering, soaked, and red from the heat, desperate for a miracle. At the Lincoln Hospital, doctors did everything they could, but the damage was already irreversible. The official report later listed the cause of death as thermal burns and injuries from exposure to hot steam, a manner accidental. When the radiator valve blew in the Ambrose sisters' room, the release of steam was instant and catastrophic. Unlike dry heat, steam carries enormous amounts of energy and it transfers it directly into skin and airways. At over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, it causes severe burns in less than a second, and because it surrounds the body, there is no escape from contact. The two girls were asleep just feet from the radiator. The violent burst woke them, and neighbors recalled hearing their screams, the first reaction to sudden searing pain and the suffocating heat that filled the room. Inhaling that vapor would have burned their mouths, throats, and lungs almost immediately, making it difficult to cry out for long. Each breath scalded the airway further, swelling it shut, while their skin blistered in the dense fog. Within moments, the small bedroom had become a sealed chamber of heat. The girls' bodies overheated rapidly, their core temperatures spiking in a condition the medical examiner later described as horrible. Their screams stopped quickly, not because the danger lessened, but because they were already being overwhelmed. By the time firefighters forced their way in, both sisters were unresponsive, with their injuries just being too severe to survive. The malfunction came down to a single critical weak point in the radiator, the valve assembly. On old steam systems, that valve regulates how much vapor enters the cast iron radiator and also serves as a release point for pressure. It's basically a safety component, and when it fails, all the force of the building's steam lines has only one place to go. In the Ambrose's apartment, the valve didn't just leak, it blew off entirely. Investigators and witnesses said it was as if the cap had been shot across the room. That left an open hole directly connected to the high-pressure steam main. In a matter of seconds, the small bedroom was flooded with vapor at more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit, like I said before. Why it failed was tied to age and poor maintenance. Many of the cluster site apartments had outdated heating systems, often decades old, with corroded parts and patchwork fixes. Tenants had complained about heat and radiator issues in the building before, but those concerns hadn't been addressed. In fact, the landlord, Mosh Pyler, had a long history of violations, and when the parents learned of this, they sued. Not only for their daughters, but also for the pain they had suffered, because they also got quite injured. Nowhere near the same level as their daughters, but pretty bad. So in December 2017, 1 year after the incident, the parents filed a lawsuit against the city of New York. Their attorneys argued that the city knowingly placed the family in an apartment that wasn't safe, managed by a landlord with a long record of violations. Court filings highlighted that the building's owner, Mosh Pyler, had been repeatedly cited for failing to make repairs and was even on the city's worst landlord lists. The lawsuit sought damages for negligence, pointing to the city's failure to inspect and maintain the apartment before assigning it to a vulnerable family. While the case worked its way through the courts, the tragedy fueled public outrage. Under mounting pressure, New York City finally announced in 2021 that it would end the cluster site program entirely, a direct response in part to the deaths of the two girls. Also, it seems that the family won but never disclosed how much money they had received. Mostly every suburban neighborhood in the US has trees in them. They all range from different sizes, some may be quite small, but some may be large. But having these trees in these neighborhoods brings challenges. One of the biggest is storm damages. Like we all know, when a tree gets too large, it grows out large branches and many of them. And since these trees are very close to homes, when a storm hits, there's a chance that one of these branches will break off and fall on one of these houses. And obviously this is bad, so landowners will hire private contractors to cut and trim these trees. And that's what happened in the northern suburbs of Salt Lake City and Kaysville. These were quiet neighborhoods with tall cottonwoods and maple trees that have stood for decades. And since they have stood for decades, every now and then they needed to be trimmed. So one of the landlords was worried that the tree on his property was getting a bit too big. So they called a tree cutting company, and this company would send out Santos Badulio Lopez Perez and one other person. Now, Santos was quite experienced in this kind of work. With him being 49 years old, he was trusted to be the one that would climb the tree and trim it, while the other guy was at the bottom tasked with cleaning up, so taking the branches and putting it in their trailer. So on the morning of March 19th, 2025, Santos arrived for a routine job on Shadowbrook Lane in Kaysville. It was a sort of neighborhood where children played on bicycles and residents kept their lawns neat, but the trees loomed large above it all. One of those trees needed topping, a process where the upper section is removed to make way for safe felling or trimming. It is one of the most technical and hazardous parts of tree care. Santos climbed about 30 feet up, secured by his harness and ropes, and started to trim the tree, and everything was going fine. He honestly made it look easy, but tree work has a cruel truth. The margin for error is razor thin, and even when the cut is correct, the tree itself can behave unpredictably. Wood under pressure doesn't always break the way a clipper expects, and when something goes wrong, there's often no time to react. Now, as Santos made his final cut to free the top section, the wood shifted in an instant. Instead of tipping away as intended, the heavy top swung back. In a sudden, violent motion, it struck him before he had time to move clear. The force of the blow was instant and devastating. One moment, Santos was cutting with steady precision, the next he was struck hard enough to snap his head back and knock him limp. His chainsaw went silent as it swung from his lanyard, and his whole body slumped in the harness that just seconds earlier had kept him secure. Now it left him dangling in a way that made the situation feel even more dire. Suspended mid-air, motionless, his arms hanging, his helmet tilted awkwardly against the trunk he had been working on. Now, when this happened, the worker on the bottom saw this. He grabbed his phone and called 911 fast. He told them the situation. He then started to yell at Santos to see if he was still alive. Obviously, he didn't respond. Unfortunately, the worker didn't have no climbing gear, so he couldn't climb all the way to the top of the tree to try to help. He could only really just wait for emergency services to arrive. And in a few minutes after that, the Kaysville police and fire arrived quickly, joined by paramedics. The scene presented a grim challenge. Santos was still dangling in his harness, 30 feet off the ground. Reaching him meant deploying a rope rescue system, something firefighters train for but rarely have to use in real life. Crews worked quickly, rigging pulleys and lines, climbing to secure him and carefully lowering his body to the ground. When they reached him, it was clear that the injuries were too severe. Santos was unresponsive, but paramedics began CPR immediately, their voices sharp with urgency as they worked in the middle of a gathering crowd. For nearly 10 minutes, they cycled compressions and breaths, fighting to keep him alive long enough to get him to a hospital. An air ambulance was dispatched. Soon, Santos was loaded aboard and flown to the University of Utah Medical Center in Salt Lake City, the state's top trauma hospital. His family was notified. Hours later, despite the best efforts of rescuers and doctors, the news was confirmed. Santos had died from his injuries. The official reports about Santos don't give a detailed medical breakdown of his injuries, as news outlets generally avoid publishing graphic forensic details, but we can piece together a clear picture of what likely happened based on how he was struck. The falling top of the tree swung back and hit him while he was still tied. Being struck by a heavy tree section can cause massive blunt force trauma, broken bones, head injury, or internal bleeding. Why he went limp immediately, witnesses and rescuers described him as unconscious, hanging in his harness. That suggests he either suffered a serious head impact, concussion, or skull fracture, or such severe chest or abdominal trauma that he lost consciousness right away. Why CPR was needed? Paramedics started CPR as soon as he was lowered, meaning his heart had either stopped or was barely beating. This points to injuries that disrupted vital organs, possibly a crushed chest, massive internal bleeding, or traumatic brain injury. So in plain terms, he'd likely had a catastrophic head, chest, or upper body impact, clearly loss of consciousness, internal bleeding, and organ trauma, which is absolutely devastating. A GoFundMe page to help support his wife and children was launched, sharing memories of Santos as a kind, hardworking man who lived for his family. Messages poured in from strangers moved by the story, each one acknowledging the unfairness of a life cut so short. In every big city, there are people who chase thrills where others only see routine. For some, that means climbing bridges or sneaking into abandoned buildings. For others, it means testing themselves against the machines that keep the city alive. In New York, one of the most dangerous stunts of all is train surfing. Climbing onto the outside of a moving train and riding it as it races through the night. Most people only see trains from the inside, rows of seats, fluorescent lights, the rocking sway of steel on steel. But from the outside, those trains are massive and unforgiving machines. Their surfaces are slick with grime, their roofs are pressed dangerously close to tunnels and overhead wires. It is a gamble with death. Yet, on a summer night in 2018, a 24-year-old man named Michael Vigilant decided to take that gamble. He traveled from his hometown of Hudson, New Hampshire to New York City and found himself near Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. Crowds poured into the streets after a game, commuters flooded the platforms, and above all, the trains kept rolling. But Michael wasn't interested in riding inside. Along with at least one companion, he climbed onto the top of a Metro North train as it began its journey north. To really understand the danger he faced, you need to know how these trains work. Unlike buses or cars which run on fuel, many New York commuter trains are powered by electricity. And that electricity doesn't come from a battery. Instead, it comes from catenary wires, thick lines suspended above the tracks. These wires carry enormous voltage, between 12,000 and 25,000 volts. For comparison, the outlet in your living room wall carries about 120 volts. A shock from that can injure or even kill under the wrong conditions. And the overhead wires above trains carry 100 to 200 times that amount. So a single touch is more than enough to end a life. But Michael may have not fully understood this. On the roof, the experience would have felt wild and cinematic. The Bronx skyline rushing past, the wind whipping at his clothes, and the whole city spread out beneath him. Inside, passengers had no idea someone was balancing on the roof above their heads. Then, as the train picked up speed, Michael moved too close to the wires overhead. What happened next was as sudden as it was horrific. The instant his body touched the catenary wire, a torrent of electricity surged into him. Witnesses inside the train later described seeing a flash of light, like a bolt of lightning erupting overhead, followed by a loud crackling snap. For those looking upward, it was as if a human being had collided with raw lightning. The current didn't just jolt him, it consumed him. His muscles seized so violently that his entire body locked stiff. His spine arced backward, his jaw clamped shut, with his hands curled into claws he couldn't release. This is what high voltage does. It overrides the brain, forcing every muscle into a spasm at once. Where the electricity entered his body, it blasted deep, blackened wounds called entry burns. The flesh there wasn't just singed, it was cooked by the heat of the current. Inside, the electricity carved its path through blood vessels, nerves, and vital organs. That path of destruction left catastrophic damage. Tissue burned, vessels ruptured, and signals scrambled. His heart's rhythm collapsed instantly, thrown into deadly fibrillation. At the same time, the electrical assault froze the muscles of his chest, paralyzing his ability to breathe. The current needed an exit point, and it found one through his feet, pressed against the metal roof. There, the burns were even worse. Charred patches where flesh, muscle, and even bone had been torn apart by the heat. Smoke rose from his body, with the smell of scorched clothing and burned skin spread across the train. If Michael remained conscious for even a fraction of a second, the pain would have been unimaginable. Survivors of lesser shocks describe the feeling as being set on fire from the inside, with every nerve igniting at once. But in this case, the current was too strong and too overwhelming. Within moments, his body collapsed. Passengers below felt the train jolt as the conductor hit the emergency brake. Word spread quickly. Someone was on the roof. For some riders who dared to look, saw the aftermath. The figure of a man crumpled against the steel, with smoke still curling into the night air. When emergency crews reached him, the damage told the story plainly. His clothes were scorched, the fabric burned away in places. His skin was blistered, blackened, and split at the points where the current had entered and exited. His body was still, no pulse and no breath. The electricity had destroyed him in less than a second, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. Back in Hudson, New Hampshire, his community was stunned. For most, the very idea of climbing on a moving train seemed foreign, something they had only seen in movies or YouTube clips. Few had ever heard the term train surfing, yet there was a young man they knew killed in one of the most brutal ways imaginable, hundreds of miles away in New York. Experts explained what happened in plain terms. High voltage electricity doesn't merely pass through you, it obliterates. Blood can heat so quickly that it clots instantly. Muscles contract with such a force, they tear themselves apart. Nerves are destroyed, leaving the brain unable to send or receive signals, with the heart and lungs shutting down not gently but violently, as their natural rhythms are replaced with chaos. Survivors of this are almost unheard of, and those who do live often wake up without limbs, with horrific scars, or with lifelong disabilities.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.